As Dean Cleveland was describing the scope of this conference, I couldn't help but be reminded of some of the wisdom of President Dwight Eisenhower, who, as you recall, had plenty of experience as a commanding general in World War II. And Eisenhower liked to say in his later years that specific plans for horrible events, as soon as you get into the crisis, often they became not so relevant, not so useful, but planning was always essential. And so I salute you here at the University of Maryland for going through this exercise. I think it's a crucial contribution to the university community, and you're to be, I think, sincerely congratulated for that. It's also nice to have a serious forum here. When my book, The Mirage Man, was first coming out, we're always victim of the news cycle, and at that point in time, it was really hard to be heard above the din of all of the controversy over a particular congressman from New York named Anthony Weiner. It got so silly at some point that some of my friends were saying that it was really a Willman-Weiner war. And I was glad to see it finally pass with the congressman's withdrawal from the public stage. So good to be with you here in this serious forum and talking about something obviously that is of such shock and lasting significance to the United States and obviously to this region, as Dean Cleveland alluded to, and that's the Anthrax letter attacks of 2001. So allow me to just recap a little bit for some of you what that was about. I was thinking about your ages, your respective ages when those letter attacks hit. And some of you probably were obviously not in high school, so it happened quite a while ago. I'm sure you have some memory of it. But these were taped 3.5 by 6.25 inch envelopes, each of which was laced with just a pinch of white powder, off-white powder, Bacillus anthracis, which is, in our layman's terms, anthrax. These letters ended up killing 5 people, including 2 U.S. postal workers in the Washington, D.C. region, made 17 others quite sick, including several mail handlers who survived awful inhalational anthrax infections and hospitalizations. The first death, however, from a letter that was one of these anthrax-laced letters, occurred to a photo editor, a journalist, who was working at the parent offices of the National Enquirer in Palm Beach County, Florida. Probably the biggest event in the initial emergence of the anthrax letter attacks occurred on October 15th, 2001. That's when a letter addressed to Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle was opened and white powder spilled out. It would be impossible at this time, even this late date, to overstate the panic that ensued from that event. There was a separate letter, I should add, anthrax-laced letter that was addressed to Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Pat Leahy. Fortunately, that letter, due to a computer coding glitch, never arrived on Capitol Hill, and it was discovered later in a batch of quarantine mail out by Dulles Airport. But think about the October 15th event with Senator Daschle. Here we have anthrax, which our government had characterized as a weapon of mass destruction, landing squarely within the heart of our national government. So again, it would be hard to overstate the panic, the confusion that followed that. Let me just tick off several things that happened here. The Hart Senate office building, where Daschle's letter was opened on the 5th floor, and the most heavily occupied Senate office building in Washington, was shut down for several months for intense cleanup. Several House buildings were also affected, other Senate buildings. In fact, the Speaker of the House of Representatives shut down all operations of the House for a week. The operations of the United States Supreme Court had to be shifted from the court building to a separate courthouse in Washington, the first time the court had conducted any official business outside of its building since that building had been opened decades earlier. Delivery of all mail stopped at the White House for years, I think to this day, as a matter of fact. There were huge impacts. You talk about the commercial and business impact, huge impacts on business, on credit card companies, on government mail, and even on residential mail, with literally billions of dollars of consequences for both government and the private sector. As I also establish in this book, The Mirage Man, the Anthrax letter attacks had other more lasting, and the 5 deaths, which are horrific tragedies and always will be for those families, but the lasting impacts for our society have even had, I would say, more profound effects and impacts. First of all was the Patriot Act, which I'm sure you've all heard something about, but it was legislation that was drafted immediately following the September 11th attacks. And of course, it was the precedent of September 11th that just amplified the panic with the Anthrax letter attacks. The Patriot Act was actually, despite the considerable public concern about the September 11th attacks, was being slowed down in the Senate. Senator Leahy, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, in consultation with the Senate leadership, including Majority Leader Daschle, was slowing things down as they do in the Senate. That is the great deliberative body, and the objective there is to do what you're supposed to do in the Senate, which is actually read the bill. But then the Anthrax letter attacks hit, and there was no more waiting. I've had members of both houses on both sides of the aisle tell me that at that point in time there was no opportunity to delay any further. It was rammed through the House without members being familiar with the line details of that legislation. And obviously the Patriot Act has just tremendous consequences for civil liberties in this country. The second major policy consequence of the Anthrax letter attacks was the debate about whether or not we should go to war with Iraq. The Anthrax attacks at WMD was literally almost, in the case of Senator Daschle's office, although Daschle is not in this category of those who were gunning for Saddam, but it was a gift in the lap of the ideologues who wanted to go after Saddam. Let's recall that some of those ideologues, namely Defense Secretary Don Rumsfeld, Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz, were among a list of ideologues who had written a letter to then President Clinton in 1998 saying that the only acceptable policy in the Middle East was to take out Saddam Hussein, obviously forcibly. So the Anthrax attacks were immediately spun and glommed onto by those who were gunning for Saddam. In the interviews for my book, Paul Wolfowitz, I would say to his credit, acknowledged that he was convinced that the Anthrax letter attacks were perpetrated by either Iraq, Saddam Hussein, and or al-Qaeda. He was convinced of that through the launch of war against Iraq. And Tom Ridge, who became President Bush's Homeland Security advisor and the first Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, told me that without question there were people throughout the administration, more importantly throughout the White House, who were absolutely convinced that Saddam was behind the Anthrax letter attacks. And he characterized that, did Tom Ridge, as an example, and a very unfortunate example, of conclusions getting ahead of facts and evidence. Former President Bush himself, it amazes me how this observation he made in his memoir, Decision Points, has not gotten hardly any circulation in the media that I'm aware of. President Bush said very little about the Anthrax letter attacks in Decision Points, but he did say that the big question in the run-up to war was, concerning the letter attacks, was who was responsible for those attacks. And he quickly followed that by saying that a, quote, respected European intelligence service had told the administration in real time that Saddam Hussein was behind the Anthrax letter attacks. So, huge impact. Another direct consequence of the Anthrax letter attacks is something called Project BioShield, which sets aside billions of dollars for the development of medical products that are intended someday to perhaps make us safer in the event of another biological attack, an instance of bioterrorism. In tandem with Project BioShield, this country has by now spent over $60 billion exponentially growing these containment laboratories, and that's not quite an oxymoron, but it's highly questionable as to how good these facilities are at keeping pathogens such as anthrax within their walls. So we're growing these facilities as we speak. We've brought in over 11,000 new scientists and technicians who have daily access to these awful, highly portable pathogens. And I don't have to tell you smart students what the security implications of that are. I mean, that is an ongoing 24/7 security problem for this country, making sure that we don't have another enemy within who would do harm to his own or her own country with these materials. So taking all this into account, the anthrax letter attacks, in my estimation, based on my research, clearly rank among the most consequential crimes in our nation's history, and also the most scientifically challenging case in the history of federal law enforcement. So, I'd like you to stand back with me, if you could, just for a second, from the yellow tape perimeter of the crimes, and perhaps you'll agree with me that given these severe consequences of policy, there must be some life-saving lessons to be learned and applied from the anthrax letter attacks. If anybody disagrees with me, please raise your hand. The difficulty is, and this gets to me taking on this project of the Mirage Man, none of this can happen. The learning of the lessons, the application of those lessons can happen if the underlying fundamental facts and circumstances surrounding the original crimes remain confused or worse, vandalized. So it was my belief, it is my belief, that the country deserves to know what happened here. We're a decade on from the events, and this is why I set out to research and write this book, to separate verifiable fact from fiction. This book is an on-the-record account. I decided at the outset to let the chips fall where they may. And I found that in the aftermath, in combing back through the record, conducting more than 300 interviews, reading tens of thousands of pages of documents, I found that in the aftermath of the anthrax letter attacks, a time when the country most needed journalists to be scrupulous and skeptical in their reporting, too many accounts took at face value or amplified claims that were just dead wrong. So I deconstruct a number of examples of this in the book, and I'm not going to regale you with too many of them here, but I'll just give you a couple. On October 26, 2001, Brian Ross, chief investigative correspondent for ABC News, probably the most prominent investigative journalist in broadcast news, came on air on World News Tonight. World News Tonight led with his exclusive report, saying that based on firsthand sources that he had, that Ross and ABC had, that the anthrax sent to Senator Daschle had been chemically treated, quote, weaponized, but chemically treated, apparently with bentonite, a material that is a signature of Saddam Hussein's former biological weapons program. Similar reports persisted in the run-up to war over the next more than a year, and not just within the established mainstream media, although there are plenty of such accounts. I want to particularly mention on May 1st, 2002, JAMA, the influential scientific and medical publication, formerly known as the Journal of the American Medical Association, reported that the attack material, the anthrax used in the letter attacks, had been, quote, chemically treated, unquote, to make it more lethal. The JAMA authors attached no footnote and cited no basis or attribution for that assertion, an assertion which continues to be repeated in the scientific literature, in the vaunted peer-reviewed scientific literature, and of course it has derivative impact on accounts that are in the blogosphere and in the mainstream media. My research for the Mirage Man found that there was no credible basis for these assertions, none, all of which fueled the rush to war. So if Saddam Hussein or al-Qaeda weren't responsible for the anthrax letter attacks, of course the big question is, who did it? We could fill, as it turns out, an entire book with other media accounts that fingered a particular individual, an American, a former biowarfare researcher named Stephen Hatfill. And once again, I can tell you that my research has found, and the United States government has as much admitted, in fact, they have admitted and have paid $5.82 million of our money to Stephen Hatfill as testament that there's no there. Stephen Hatfill is not the guy. So on to the question of who could have done this. The Mirage Man provides the first biographical portrait of a particular scientist. You may have heard of him, a fellow named Bruce Ivins. And to compose that biographical portrait in the Mirage Man, I traveled to a small town in the southwestern corner of Ohio, about 40 miles outside Cincinnati, called Lebanon, Ohio. It's a town that evokes to this day, the main street evokes the middle America of Norman Rockwell. And it's where Bruce Ivins was born in 1946, the youngest of 3 sons. Bruce's father, Randall Ivins, was a pharmacist and the second-generation proprietor of a family business called Ivins Drugs, established in 1893. Randall was a graduate of Princeton, and he was a well-liked, generous, very chatty man. But appearances can be deceiving, and I think this is a through line for maybe this conference, which is appearances can be deceiving and assumptions need to be constantly tested and reevaluated. So I went to Lebanon and proceeded to interview as many people, and it turns out there's a lot of them still around who went to school with Bruce Ivins, grew up with him, who taught him, who cast him in a high school play, and who worked at the family drugstore. What I found was that the exterior of Lebanon was certainly not Norman Rockwell for Bruce Ivins. He, in fact, grew up in really was literally a house of horrors. His mother, Mary Ivins, exerted tyrannical dominance in the home and actually at Ivins Drugs. And she attacked Randall Ivins, it turned out, I learned, with whatever might be at hand. It could be a broom handle, could be a fork into the hand, could be a skillet to the head. And she micromanaged Bruce, who she saw as her prodigy. Bruce's schoolmates, his teachers, and others who knew the family in Lebanon told me that in their estimation, Mary Ivins left a lasting and a haunting mark on him. Yet it's also important to recognize that from an early age, Bruce Ivins was a scientifically gifted student and at the same time abnormally isolated socially. He had very few friends. He was known as the kid you could always see walking around by himself. And soon enough in his life, Bruce showed that he craved and he demanded, as it turned out, 2 things. And again, these are through lines to understand Bruce Ivins. He craved and he demanded attention and acceptance. Of course, a lot of us like those things. But Bruce Ivins was different in how he went about seeking them. He sought attention and approval in increasingly strange ways and hidden ways, always in manipulative ways. You might be coming on to where this title, The Mirage Man, come from. This is part of the genesis of it, a big part of it. He held grudges. He pursued vendettas anonymously, invariably. He did these things. He tormented various women and institutions, and he did it in ways that avoided personal accountability for himself. A couple of quick examples, of which there are many in the book. After Bruce left Lebanon out of high school, he went to the University of Cincinnati, and a really powerful thing that turned out happened in his life there was, as an undergraduate, he asked another undergraduate out for what we used to call date. And she said no, she declined, and quickly forgot about it. But Bruce never did, and he attributed her rejection to her membership in a particular sorority, Kappa Kappa Gamma. And Bruce then focused his hatred and his vendetta on the institution of Kappa Kappa Gamma and on a number of Kappas who might come across him at various points in his life. One of them was a woman named Nancy Hagewood, who Bruce met at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, after he'd been hired right out of Cincinnati as a postdoctoral researcher. He became absolutely infatuated and obsessed with her. She rather quickly figured out that he was way different and tried to put some space between them, which of course he resented. I bring this up because about a year after Bruce had left Chapel Hill and moved up to Maryland with his wife, he drove the 300 plus miles from suburban Maryland down to Chapel Hill by himself. This was in 1979. And he broke into a room on campus and stole Nancy Hagewood's laboratory notebook. Nancy was a PhD student, microbiologist herself, and this was in an era before flash drives, before all the conveniences. So as a doctoral student, everything all of her pursuit of a doctorate was on the line here in that lab notebook, all of her data from her experiments. So she engaged the police, her faculty members, fellow students. They were trying to find this thing. And then Nancy soon received an anonymous note. And the anonymous note told her that if she wanted her lab notebook back, to go search in a particular U.S. mailbox on a street corner in Chapel Hill on a particular afternoon. With the help of the police, they did this. Boom, it was there. I'll get way ahead of myself and tell you that Bruce Ivins did all these things. That same year of 1979, and you know, again, this seems like kind of prankish, even though Bruce Ivins was in his mid-30s by this time. I would say pretty creepy. But some people, if it's just a one-off, you just say, well, maybe he had a bad week or something. But that same year of 1979, Bruce Ivins started seeing a psychiatrist in Washington, D.C., Dr. Naomi Heller. And again, all this is detailed in the book. But Bruce Ivins confided to Dr. Heller that, that he was completely obsessed with Nancy Hagewood. He saw in her qualities that he wished he had had in his mother and in his then wife. But he couldn't have Nancy Hagewood, and so he hated her. And he detailed to Dr. Heller a very detailed plot that he said he had just abandoned to poison her and to kill her. Again, this was in 1979. Bruce Ivins would go on to harass and torment Nancy Hagewood for years and years to come. Nonetheless, he was a PhD microbiologist, and he was a solid bench scientist. And in December of 1980, the United States Army hired him from the Defense Department's research university down in Bethesda, where he'd been working for a little over a year. The U.S. Army hired him in December 1980 to work at the Biowarfare Research Center at Fort Detrick, about 50 miles from here in Frederick, Maryland. And this was a place known as the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, known by an acronym called USAMRIID. So Ivins goes to work there. He was hired for one purpose, and that was to work with anthrax, to grow it, to purify it, to prepare it for tests on animals. He had not worked with anything dangerous of this caliber before in his career, but they brought him in for his bench skills and to work with anthrax. He was given a secret level security clearance. Ivins proved to be a quick study at Fort Detrick. Part of his, in his toolkit, you would say, was he was unfailingly deferential to the uniformed personnel, all of his superiors at Fort Detrick. He was hired as a civilian. This was a quality that was much valued in the Army culture. And the fact of the matter was that everyone knew that Bruce was a much better scientist than all the uniformed personnel. But he didn't lord that over them in any way, unlike some PhDs who the uniformed personnel felt somewhat snubbed by once in a while. Nonetheless, Bruce's secret obsessions and his vendettas, they continued. One night he drove from his home in Frederick, Maryland to West Virginia University in Morgantown and broke into through a ground level window into a Kappa house and spent the better part of an hour roaming around in there and grabbing artifacts, including what for him was a real prize, the book of ritual for Kappa Kappa Gamma. I should say he'd already done a burglary down in Chapel Hill a couple of years earlier. And in that burglary, he had gotten what's called the cipher from a Kappa house, which enabled him, once he got the book of ritual, to decode everything. I mean, Bruce was just obsessed with codes and being able to manipulate things behind the scenes, again, with anonymity. Loved the game and loved the attention that it would soon enough generate for him. So he took the book of ritual, he took the cipher, and what did he do with it? Well, he took out classified ads in 2 magazines, Mother Jones and Rolling Stone, and offered to mail all the secrets of Kappa Kappa Gamma to anyone who would write into him at this particular post office box up in Gaithersburg. That was, by the way, he took out the post office box in the name of Nancy Hagewood's husband. Nice trick, a guy named Carl Scandella. So, indeed, quite a few people wrote into him. He had a female named Carla Sander on the post office box. And I should say that a prominent columnist, Jeffrey Zaslow, was among those who bid on it and did a whole column in the Chicago Tribune on Carla Sander and her vendetta against Kappa Kappa Gamma. I guess I'm prompted to mention that because Jeffrey died a very tragic death just last Friday while giving a talk on another best-selling book that he just wrote. I had a real nice exchange with him in researching the book. But you can see very smart people were conned by Bruce Ivins over the years. But he was able to keep this bizarre behavior and this dual alternative existence hidden. But you ask yourself, was anybody noticing? Was he really keeping it all under the radar? And it turns out there were plenty of signs, I think, with the benefit of hindsight. You wouldn't even need the benefit of hindsight to see there were plenty of signs of his instability. On February 18th, 1987, in fact, Ivins completed a federal medical form and was asked questions, have you ever had any personal problems with these particular things? Hallucinations, improbable beliefs, anxiety, memory change, okay? He put question marks next to each one of those. Hallucinations, improbable beliefs. So I'd like to ask you a question. If you were supervising a scientist who had unlimited 24/7 access to the deadliest anthrax known to exist in this planet, would these responses by Bruce Ivins have caused you as a supervisor to look more closely at his suitability for this work? Those who would be yes, could you raise your hands, please? I'm interested. Any no's? Okay. I can tell you the U.S. Army was at disagreement with all of you. They did absolutely nothing. There was no follow-up. Inside of Fort Detrick, it turns out Bruce Ivins was still very much, became really the lead anthrax researcher there. And by the mid to late 1980s, his top objective assigned by his superiors was to develop a new and improved next generation anthrax vaccine, a genetically engineered recombinant anthrax vaccine. This is a project that took on a lot more importance and traction after the Persian Gulf War. And that's for this reason, just a brief backstory. There's huge controversy with service personnel who served in the Persian Gulf War coming down with a lot of sort of bizarre autoimmune problems and other more common side effects coming out of the Gulf War, and people were grasping for what could be the cause of it, and there were a lot of theories that the existing anthrax vaccine might be causing some of these very serious adverse reactions. Those theories, by the way, have never been validated. But nonetheless, they were theories at the time, and so the U.S. Army, prodded by no small amount of members of Congress who were getting contacted by people who were suffering, service members, wanted to develop this next generation anthrax vaccine. In service of that, in 1997, Bruce Ivins created a huge and unique batch of anthrax spores, highly purified spores. And these spores were going to support the remaining animal tests that Bruce thought would be necessary to bring this new vaccine online. He inventoried those spores in a flask under the code name RMR 1029. At roughly the same time, there were more growing signs, I think you'd say, of his instability. And in July 2000, again, just to bracket things, July 2000, a little bit over a year before October 2001, September 2001, he wrote in an email to a close colleague that he was having, quote, paranoid delusional thoughts, unquote. He worried that he was becoming more like his mother, who he called a, quote, undiagnosed paranoid schizophrenic, unquote. He continued to have these impulses to do physical harm. He worried in another email that he was scared to death that he might do, in his own words, and I quote, terrible things. Again, July 2000. That same month, Bruce Ivins confided to his most recent behavioral therapist a plot that he had just developed and had intended to carry out, but a last-minute glitch persuaded him not to do it, and that plot was to poison and kill a woman who had recently left USAMRIID Fort Detrick as one of his lab technicians. He was obsessed with her, did not want her to leave. She had gone on to medical school. And so he both coveted her and couldn't have her, so it was this kind of a reaction that he would take on. So again, let's just take quick inventory. As of 1987, Ivins' superiors were aware that he had indicated that he may have had hallucinations and memory changes and improbable beliefs. As of the year 2000, some of his Army colleagues knew that he was in therapy and that he was taking a number of psychiatric drugs. In fact, Ivins, every year when he had to go in to get his anthrax vaccine booster, not unlike when all of us go into a doctor's office, what's the first thing they ask you? First of all, how are you going to pay for it? What's your insurance? Second is, any new medications? What medications are you on? Any change in dosages? So every year he would go in to the special ward up at USAMRIID, get his booster shot, and he filled out forms in which he acknowledged his use of Celexa, Cymbalta, Valium, Trazodone, Ambien, Lunesta. He did keep to himself as a secret that he was also taking, as of July 2000, and for the next years, Zyprexa, which some of you may know is an antipsychotic. So again, I have to ask, if you were a supervisor in the United States Army and you were aware of these things, how many of you, if I may ask, would have tried to have learned, at least learned more about his condition? Hands? Just about everybody. Okay. I can tell you that one of the things I learned doing this book was that if Bruce Ivins had been working with chemical warfare or nuclear materials, the United States Army would have immediately removed him from duty. That's the protocol. But for some reason, when it comes to working with these agents that can be used for biological terrorism, we don't have the protocol in place, and we don't have that strict of a protocol in place to this day. In fact, one of the biggest surprises in my research came in late 2008 when I got a return on a Freedom of Information Act request I had made of the Army. And I was trying to find out, well, you know, what steps had been taken to get to the bottom of things with this fellow Bruce Ivins, who had been working with the Army for a very long time. Now, bear in mind, this was in late 2008, and the letter I got back from a United States Army major in very crisp declarative English, which I certainly appreciated, was, quote, Dr. Ivins was never evaluated by USAMRIID for mental fitness, unquote. Okay. So let's fast forward to spring and summer of 2001, actually going back from that FOIA request. It's a rewind. The next generation anthrax vaccine, which was known to some of Bruce's colleagues as Bruce's baby, was dead in the water. In the words of the supervising Army Major General, who I quoted for the first time in this book, the next-gen anthrax vaccine was beyond the back burner. Bruce Ivins knew this, and he knew it because he had been attending meetings at the Pentagon in which it was made very clear to him that we're not interested in moving this vaccine forward at this time. There's so much controversy about anthrax vaccine. If anything, we're going to shut the whole anthrax vaccine program down, and we're not interested in developing a new one at this point. So what could Bruce Ivins do about this? You'll have to take my word for it, but the proof is laid out in the book. Bruce was a student of how fear and crisis moves the bureaucracy, how fear and crisis moves the elected officials, and how it ultimately impacts, moves, changes policy. These can be huge boulders to roll up a hill. Just follow any bill on Capitol Hill. You know, apple pie tastes sweet, where you're immediately going to have half of the partisan divide taking it on. So fear and crisis, that's what breaks through the logjam. In August of 2001, Bruce Ivins began doing something he'd never done before in such stretches. He began to log really spectacular late-night hours in the biocontainment hot suites at USAMRIID, and he did so alone. His extraordinary late-night hours would continue, certainly into September. Then, of course, we had the September 11th attacks. And then on September 18th, something happened that only the perpetrator would know. And that is that the letters that were laced with anthrax were picked up out of a mailbox at 10 Nassau Street, Princeton, New Jersey, and taken to a mail processing facility where they were canceled. So the first batch of anthrax letters is now moving through the mail. 3 days later, September 21st, Bruce Ivins sends an email to Nancy Haygood, out of the blue. She hasn't heard from him in years. And he predicts in this email another big terrorist event, an event that will put Fort Detrick into 24/7 mode, just like during the Gulf War, which was a time that he celebrated as a time of the greatest social relevance of he and his colleagues at USAMRIID and Fort Detrick. So then we have, of course, the October 15, 2000 letter opening in the Senate Hart Office building, the letter to Senator Daschle. And it was just 2 days after that, I should say that within hours of that letter being opened, where was the evidence taken for analysis? USAMRIID, Fort Detrick. They have the biocontainment laboratories to supposedly control the spores, and so that's where the FBI had that material taken. 2 days after the letter arrived at Fort Detrick, Bruce Ivins himself had not just a sample of the anthrax, he had the whole envelope. And a grievous breach, I should say, of chain of custody procedures and protocol plans, specific plans that were worked out for years as to how the FBI would handle the evidence in collaboration with the U.S. Army. But you can see in a crisis that it fell apart. And it greatly complicated the FBI's work ultimately in ways that, again, the book spells out. Bruce Ivins is now handling this powder. He emailed a picture of himself working on the evidence. He emailed that picture to Nancy Haygood and a number of others. He as I quote one of his former supervisors was saying, he couldn't stop talking about it. That is the powder itself. He was just raving constantly about how spectacular it was, how frightening it was. This is the most spectacular anthrax powder that he, the anthrax expert, has ever seen. And he was also pointing the finger in emails at Saddam Hussein in Iraq and mentioning these things to the FBI. So the anthrax letter attacks at that point in time, I mean, clearly amounted to maximum shock and awe, literally a sinister spectacle of fear. I mentioned up front that one of the consequences of the anthrax letter attacks was Project BioShield, this multi-billion-dollar program to develop new medical products. And it turned out that the first contract that was, and BioShield was introduced solely because of the anthrax letter attacks. It was passed solely because of the anthrax letter attacks. You can go back and look at the record, and it's there. It turned out the first contract awarded under Project BioShield was for $877.5 million, and it was for development of the next generation anthrax vaccine, Bruce's baby, a product for which he held 2 patents. And obviously, none of it would have happened. So with that, without the attacks, with that contract, Ivins had won not only the attention, but the approval the validation that he craved. Again, I would ask, and you don't have to put your hands up this time, but does any of what I've said cause you to question why Bruce Ivins was not a major suspect of the FBI until late 2006, 5 years after the crimes? It became a huge question for me. And again, the book details it. So before closing with you here, I'd like to invoke the wisdom of Howard Baker, the longtime senator from the state of Tennessee. And Senator Baker once said that in the Washington area, we're just outside the Beltway here, he who does not toot his own horn is apt to find it untooteth. So with that as inoculation, I'd like to share this brief passage with you that's about my book, and it was written by Carl Cannon of Real Clear Politics. Mr. Cannon wrote, quote, "The Mirage Man should be required reading in every journalism school and law school in this country. It should be the textbook of a case study at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, and police academies everywhere. It should be taught in college government classes and handed out to freshman members of Congress when they arrive in Washington, and to staffers assigned to Capitol Hill committees and the White House National Security Council." I couldn't disagree with a word of that, and I thank you and welcome all your questions.
What would be the lesson for journalists that you would like to really, if you were able to stand up in front of a journalism class and say, ladies and gentlemen, what should be number 1, 2, and 3 on your ticket to be list?
Well, I'll just apply it to the reporting of the Anthrax letter attacks. I think first of all is when people tell you things that seem spectacular, like, hey, the anthrax powder sent to Senator Daschle has bentonite in it. It's been chemically treated, and it has bentonite in it, which we already knew was a signature of Saddam's program. First question a journalist has to have in their mind, you may not ask it first, but you can't end that conversation without having it satisfactorily posed, is, well, how do you know that? And it turns out, as I lay out in my book here, and I had a back and forth, I would say a productive back and forth with Brian Ross. None of his sources were first-hand sources. This was a rumor mill. This was a game of telephone. And Brian's ultimate, I guess, bottom line was to throw his sources under the bus, which is interesting because the website of ABC News, at least as of the time this book closed, was touting his exclusives on the Anthrax case. So, yeah, I mean, we need to ask, how do you know that? I'm sure there's some other, could you remind me of another aspect of your question? No, that's the most important question. How is it that you know that? And then, because, you know, when there's a crisis, my experience is, and the Anthrax letter attacks for a journalist were incredibly difficult. First of all, you know, the Washington national media, you have some of the best journalists around, but what's the bread and butter of Washington-based media? It's politics. It's the rhetorical back and forth of politics. Well, to write about the Anthrax letter attacks, you got to get on top of the science. And the people who are willing to say the things that are most perhaps quotable in a crisis, it's my experience, are quite often people who know absolutely nothing about the case, know absolutely nothing about the evidence. They're talking out of their hat, but they're getting on TV, they're getting circulated out there, and they're taking a shot. Unfortunately, the people who might know the most about it, I mean, for instance, the conclusive proof that the anthrax attack material was not chemically treated came no later than March, April of 2002, after scientists at the San Diego National Laboratories, with the best technology and the best personnel to interpret the data, they established that the material was not treated, that the element silicon was in the material, but it was on the inside of the spores. In other words, it came from the growth of the spores. It was not from an external treatment. That information from San Diego was briefed confidentially by the FBI to a handful of people on Capitol Hill and certain people in the executive branch. Of course, the Bush administration was not eager at all to give any credence to the San Diego data because it sort of fouled up the playbook of keeping at least a big question mark, if not a whisper campaign, that Saddam was behind the letter attacks. But to get more to the point, the Sandia data was never cited in a single media account in the run-up to war. Instead, we had these page one stories. We had ABC News with not just that first account on October 21st, 2002. There were a long-running series of accounts saying that the material had been chemically treated. You had JAMA with respected scientists. I think there was 17, 18 co-authors signing their name to that thing. And I was able to interview a handful of those co-authors. And I said, well, what about this assertion that the material was chemically treated to reduce clumping, to weaponize it, to make it more lethal? And they said, well, I didn't have anything to do with that. That came from so-and-so, that came from so-and-so. So very, very strange. But once these myths get out there, it's very tough to put them back in the bottle. Yes, sir?
Can you start with the story of what happened? How did they catch Ivan? Where is he now?
Well, there was a war within the FBI investigation over the direction of this case. The guy who was handpicked by Director Mueller, brought in from San Diego to run this case, and he ran it from October 2002 into September of 2006, was absolutely convinced that Stephen Hatfield was a perpetrator. There were a couple, and one in particular whose picture appears in this book, and you won't read his name in any other media account to this day, but he became convinced based on the evidence that he was going through, including the thing that started tipping Agent Alexander in this direction, was reviewing the tip that came in by phone from Nancy Hagewood on January 31st, 2002, in response to a mass mailing that the FBI did to all 30,000 members of the American Society for Microbiology. One member of ASM responded to that, and it was Nancy Hagewood. And she said, look, this guy is completely capable of doing it. I wouldn't be at all surprised if he's the guy, and here's why. And she laid out this decades-long tormenting and harassing, okay? So Alexander went out to Seattle, interviewed her repeatedly, started gathering more and more evidence. The real aha moment for Agent Alexander came with the help of one of his colleagues, a woman named Agent Robin Powell. And she, like Agent Alexander, was pursuing Bruce Ivins really on their own time. They didn't have the license from the FBI to be doing it. But she was questioning, well, why 10 Nassau Street, Princeton? It's the only mailbox of over 600 in the Trenton, New Jersey area where spores were found that linked up with the letter attacks. And Agent Powell put in Kappa Kappa Gamma and Princeton. Boom. 20 Nassau Street. 65 paces away from that mailbox. Fourth floor office of KKG looks almost right down on that mailbox. For Bruce Ivins, if you appreciate the history of Bruce Ivins, this is the kind of delicious twist and irony that he derives incredible gratification from. He loves the game. He loves the asymmetric advantage of anonymity that he had. So that became a turning point for Alexander. He would stand up literally in meetings and take on the powers that be. I mean, I think the guy deserves a Congressional Medal of Honor for speaking truth to power, for challenging the status quo, certainly at no benefit to his career. I mean, he's not winning any promotions for it. But the director of the FBI, finally in September, October of 2006, and the director comes in for a fair amount of illumination in this book, but I have to give him credit. He removed, let me rephrase that. He transitioned the then director of the case down to Tennessee, and he put in charge two veteran, highly experienced criminal investigators to run the Anthrax case. And their mantra from day one was, with all of their squad, was we're going to reevaluate all assumptions, and I don't care where this case has gone before, we're going to take a fresh look at everything. And within 6 weeks, Stephen Hatfield was off their radar. He was virtually exonerated because Hatfield was a virologist, not a bacteriologist. Bacillus anthracis, as those of you who are taking all your core classes I know that it's a bacterium. And Hatfield did not have any experience in handling anthrax. And he had no access to a biocontainment laboratory in the 2 full years preceding the anthrax letter attacks. So that dog just wasn't hunting. So that's how it turned around. And of course, then when they got the evidence of Ivins' extraordinary pattern of late night hours in the hot suite. Unlike any other scientist who had access to RMR 1029, that was a huge development. Anybody else? Yep.
My question is, do you think that Ivans had any economical goals in the Anthrax attacks? Because you told that his laboratory got around, I think, 800 million, was it? Or around that for his, next generation?
No, the excuse me, the federal government awarded a contract worth over $870 million to develop the next generation anthrax vaccine. The U.S. Army by that time had licensed that product to a very small California biotech called VaxGen. So the contract was awarded to VaxGen, contingent on VaxGen actually delivering the vaccine. But Ivans was a patent holder and stood to gain royalty income. I mean, U.S. law allows scientists in this circumstance to keep up to $150,000 a year in royalties. But so to get to the heart of your question, though, was there a financial motive? We don't know. And to finish off, actually, the response to you, what happened to Bruce Ivans? Bruce Ivans, on July 29th, 2008, died of an overdose of Tylenol. So he's no longer with us. And he did that after being informed by his lawyers a week or so previous that he was going to be indicted for the 5 anthrax murders. So back to the motive of was it financial? He complained in some private correspondence that I got access to for this book. He would complain about his down at the heels existence, living in a clapboard house in Frederick, and talking about how expensive it was to get a nice house. On the other hand, he was not a guy who flaunted material possessions. I mean, he wore old shabby clothes. He rode a rickety bicycle the 200 yards from his house through the gates of Fort Detrick. I think, based on what I learned about Bruce Ivans from some of those people I told you about and from his close family members, I think he was a man who was driven by the need for attention and approval, and the gratification that he got in playing games with people and institutions. So I think the prospect of him making any money, and he did make some money, by the way. He made, even though the vaccine was ultimately flopped, that California biotech couldn't scale it up and produce it, and so they didn't get all that $877 million by a long shot. Bruce Ivans got about $12,000 in royalties for a period of 2 or 3 years. If I had to throw a dart, I would say that the motivation was his thirst for approval and attention, and in his realm, scientific validation. This was the career-capping validation for him to have this anthrax vaccine minted by way of that federal contract. Yes?
And he was also probably mentally unwell by this time, as he was alluding to. But I was going to say, I'm a journalism student, and I think that was a really compelling narrative you just told us. I think I got chills. That was awesome. But I was wondering, so you found out about this character through the FBI's and counseling. How much work did you go through? You said you visited Lebanon, and what was it like going back and chronicling this character and finding out so much about? You seem to know him like the back of your hand, That seems incredible. So can you tell us about that? And did you then go to Frederick and find out about his life there, and what was that like?
Right. So let me give you a telescoped version of over 3 years of research. This book stands on the shoulders of my work for the Los Angeles Times. And on August 1st of 2008, I broke the story in the LA Times of the suicide of this previously unknown Army researcher who in death stood accused of being the anthrax mailer. I first heard about Bruce Ivans in March of 2008. I should back up a second and say in the previous couple of years I've been doing a lot of research for stories in the LA Times about our government's response to the perceived threats of biological terrorism. Let me remove the word perceived. It is a threat, but it depends on agent by agent as to how much of a threat each one of those is. And I was very interested in what some of our policy and contractual responses were to that threat. That prompted me to do a major takeout that was published on December 2nd, 2007 about the old line anthrax vaccine and this next generation anthrax vaccine. And I brought to light all the behind-the-scenes knife fighting and politics and lobbying that helped sink the next generation anthrax vaccine. So I didn't realize at that point in time, by the way, that a fellow named Bruce Ivins was a co-inventor of the vaccine. So let's fast forward then a few months into March of 2008. I was talking to a lot of my previous sources, and this one fellow told me, hey, you know, I got visited yesterday by a couple of fellows from the FBI. Oh, really? Yeah, they're asking me about, 3, 4 people. Oh, really? Who were they? He says, well, they didn't have me sign a non-disclosure agreement, so I guess I can tell you. Oh, yeah, you can tell me. So we go through them. I said, okay, well, what about Eric? He's kind of an asshole, but there's no, he's this, and that. No. Well, how about John? Oh, Eagle Scout. I mean, here's his history. Okay. What about Bruce? Oh, squirrely. And then he proceeds to tell me a lot of personal anecdotes about Bruce based on his supervision of Bruce back in the late 80s. And so it kind of got me thinking a little bit. And then I was, I should say, being contacted by one of Bruce's friends who worked up at Fort Detrick, who was basically playing a violin for Bruce, saying that he was being harassed by the FBI, and that his family was being harassed by the FBI, and that a lot of people were being harassed up at Fort Detrick, and people have hired attorneys, et cetera, et cetera. So then I started going through, okay, well, who's been harassed? Who's hired attorneys? Well, only one's hired an attorney, and that's Bruce. Okay. So then at that point in time, I really decided to start drilling down on Bruce Ivins. And I went back to his high school with the help of my talented research assistant and got his high school annuals. I was looking through that. And then started interviewing more people about him, and I found an old Army Administrative Investigative report, actually a report that was produced in the spring, May of 2002. Let me tell this real quickly. It turns out that there was a whole bunch of loose anthrax spores found outside of the biocontainment areas at Fort Detrick in April of 2002. I'll spare you all the details. It's all in the book. But Bruce Ivins, in the course of the Army administrative investigation to try and get on top of this, admitted in sworn statement to the Army colonel who was investigating this, who, by the way, is not an investigator. This is an Army 15-6 investigation. It's basically to do things quickly and let's move forward. But the investigation did collect a lot of sworn statements, so it did have value. Bruce Ivins, in his sworn statement, said that he started using bleach to clean up anthrax spores from his own personal office area that he shared with 2 other people beginning in December of 2001. One of his colleagues, who was his current supervisor, said, well, no, Bruce told me actually that he started doing it in November. So somewhere between November and December, he's going around his office area at night with bleach where he had found what he thought were spores after he plated them out, and didn't tell anybody about it, kept it totally silent from the chain of command, covered it up. Now, this comes out in this Army report, and one of Bruce's statements to the investigators when they said, well, did you go back after you bleached and confirmed with more swabbing to make sure you got all the spores? I can't remember. Okay, you talk to any microbiologist, certainly anybody who's handling anthrax, and that response there is a huge red flag. But it's in the record of the Army investigation. The Army handed over that report to the FBI in May, June of 2002, and what did the FBI do with it? Absolutely nothing, until Lawrence Alexander won this war within the investigation. So that's a long way of saying of how I got onto Bruce Ivins. That 400-plus page report, that Army report that I got access to, really helped launch me toward wanting to do what was going to be a profile of Bruce Ivins. And then I found out in a very odd way that he had killed himself. No other journalist was aware of it. And basically, my life has not been the same since. Yeah. Yes?
I'm just curious, what were the biggest obstacles or challenges that you faced in all of this field of investigation? Like any sources that were really difficult to talk to, or any people who wouldn't talk to unless they were on deep background,
Yes. Big challenges. And one of my initial challenges was I left the LA Times in mid-November of 2008 to go after this book project, and I was a little concerned that if I couldn't call up and say I was with the LA Times, that nobody would talk to me. To my great relief, more often than not, the opposite was true. People were more willing to talk to me, particularly the townspeople in Ohio. The only place where that was a problem, not having that LA Times badge on my chest, was on Capitol Hill, where Hill staff, they don't, well, you're not important, we're not going to talk to you. But I broke through that. The more substantive challenge that I had was everybody's scared to death to reveal information, to say what they think is the truth. So I mentioned this fellow John cryptically a moment ago. He was a respected microbiologist, civilian employee at Fort Detrick, who hired Bruce Ivins in 1980, who shared an office with him in the 80s, who is the only microbiologist in the United States Army at Fort Detrick who has ever grown Ames strain anthrax, that's a strain of anthrax used in the attacks, and actually handled it, dried it, and handled it in powdered form in an authorized way. Now, I should say that he irradiated that anthrax before it was powdered so it wouldn't kill anybody. But this was a guy who knew Bruce Ivins for 20-plus years. And I first visited him at his log house up in Sharpsburg, Maryland, beyond the Antietam battlefield in the fall of 2008, and it was, his ground rules were off the record. I mean, completely off the record, even though he, at that point, was retired from the Army. He had signed, as is anyone else who knew about the case, had to sign non-disclosure agreements with the FBI. Everybody was locked up. Huge challenge for me. But I just kept working at it, and by the time this book was between hardcovers, I had interviewed John Ezell more than 100 times. And, I mean, sat down repeatedly with him and tested all of my assumptions about the science, all the assumptions about what he knew about the evidence, the handling of the evidence. He was the FBI's appointed liaison to be in control of safeguarding that evidence when it went up to Fort Detrick. So, by the way, when it was handed to Bruce Ivins, that was done behind his back. So all those highly sensitive things. And he ultimately is on the record in this book. This is an on-the-record book about things that he's comfortable being on the record on. So those were huge challenges. The FBI, no one from the FBI would talk to me. I'll tell you right now, I've said this before, the first story I did for the LA Times, which was published again on August 1st, 2008, not a single person from the FBI or any investigator talked to me before we broke that story. No one from the FBI would talk to me before March of 2010. Yeah, March in 2010, after the case was formally closed. Because even though Ivins had committed suicide, the case technically remained open because they were still gathering certain evidence. And that was very nervous-making for me because clearly to write the definitive story about answering your faculty member's question here about how did this investigation finally turn on Bruce Ivins? Well, I needed to talk to people inside the FBI and inside the Justice Department. So here I am, well over a year and a half out on a book project, and I don't have access to those people. So it was a tremendous challenge. But there was plenty of other things to be doing in the meantime, in the research. Yep. Yes?
Alluded to, I think, what you thought were some of the bureaucratic shortcomings that led into this, but from a prevention standpoint, what systematic lessons do you think there are for us to draw here? Or is this just a case of one individual with poor intentions?
Well, first of all, as one of our honor students said here about Bruce Ivins is definitely, was a disturbed individual. So to some extent, you have to say someone like that can defy rational analysis. However, there were plenty of red flags, and I think what's the lesson carrying forward? And I think the lesson also can be derived from Dr. Nassan, the psychiatrist who killed all those people down in Fort Hood, is that when there are examples of strange behavior or unanswered questions about a person's stability, and they're working with something as sensitive, as lethal, as portable as anthrax, or plague, or you name your select list pathogen, you got to call time out. You got to get that person out and seriously scrutinize them. The other things that I think need to be done, first of all, I'm going to slip side the question about whether we should be proliferating all these laboratories. Are we safer by doing that? I think you could probably guess where I come down on that question. But if we're going to be working with anthrax in these laboratories, shouldn't we have mandatory cameras in the hot suites? So at least you have some record of what's going on. There were no cameras at USAMRIID throughout this whole episode. Shouldn't we, as we do with other weapons of mass destruction, have a mandatory two-person rule where you can't work with Anthrax unless there's at least two people in the lab? The biodefense community to this day very successfully opposes that kind of a requirement, which I find to be really curious. The one other laboratory that had access to RMR 1029 was the Battelle Memorial Institute. It's an entity based in Columbus, Ohio area that does a lot of work under contract to the FBI, CIA, intelligence community. And in each case where RMR 1029 was brought out of a flask to be worked with, they had not only cameras, but they had two people working in the suites. And in the period of time when RMR 1029 was worked on, there was never an instance where the same two people were working with it one day after the other. And there were none of these irregular late nights. So, what's the prescription going forward? First of all, much more rigorous scrutiny of the human beings that are working on this stuff. I think they ought to apply immediately the same standard that is used for nuclear and chemical. And I think there ought to be mandatory cameras in the suites. A lot of those have been installed voluntarily. I should say that Fort Detrick has done that now on a voluntary basis. And I also think there's a strong argument to be made for the two-person rule.